The producer decided to run replays of that over into the coverage. Boycott didn't enjoy looking back at the footage, and the only time he will mention it is if someone asks him, which was a regular occurrence on those Caribbean tours. But again, good old Jeffrey always had his comeback. "I made him famous," was his standard retort.
No holding back.
Michael Holding, No Holding Back, the autobiography. Chapter 10. Fast bowler for hire. For someone who never thought he would make a living from playing cricket, I turned out to be quite the international freelancer, a globetrotter who, West Indies and Jamaica aside, played for Rishton, Lancashire and Derbyshire in the UK, Tasmania in Australia and Canterbury in New Zealand. As a youth, I was presented a prize by George Headley at a Melbourne Cricket Club end of season presentation function. I can't remember exactly what it was for, but what I do remember is that a few weeks later, after that, he gave me a picture taken of me receiving the award, and on the back of the photo he wrote, "Play cricket and see the world." Despite George's words, I never imagined bowling fast would take me to such diverse and numerous parts of the world to play and talk the international language of cricket. Not even when I was playing World Series cricket did I think it would be a profession. It was only an inkling. It only became a possibility thanks to Packer changing the landscape. Playing Lancashire League cricket was my first venture into professional cricket outside West Indies, so let's start there. Obviously, when playing for the West Indies, I was getting paid, but don't forget that I still had the day job. After leaving Barclays Bank, I was dividing my time between the field of play and the Central Data Processing Unit in Jamaica, the computer department of the government, thanks to Michael Manley, the Prime Minister. When I got offered a job to play league cricket in 1981, I had to give up that role, as much through guilt at taking the wage when all I seemed to do was play cricket, but also because, in strict terms, my job at the government computer department gave me leave, with pay, to represent my country. Playing cricket for Rishton certainly didn't fall under that category. I had been in England in 1980 with the West Indies, and whilst I was there in Manchester for the test match, which ended in a rather tame draw, Wilf Woodhouse, the chairman of Rishton, came to see me. He wanted to find out if I was interested in playing Lancashire League cricket for the 1981 summer. Playing professional in England had not crossed my mind since I had turned down Tony Gregg's offer to join Sussex, and, to be honest, I thought it was something I would only do towards the end of my career, if at all. But Wilf was very enthusiastic. I liked that. He told me that the standard of cricket was good. I would not find it a chore, and they only played at weekends. Wilf also reminded me of the great West Indies players who had appeared in the league down the years, and the thought of following in their footsteps of the likes of Wes Hall, Charlie Griffiths and George Headley certainly appealed. He said that Rishton would pay me $5,000 for the summer. In those days that was a lot of money, especially for playing at weekends only. After discussing it further, I thought, why not? In the summer of 1981, I didn't need to be anywhere with the West Indies, and we were not due in Australia for the 1981-82 series until December. I had all the time in the world. I enjoyed my time with Rishton, although not the cricket. It was not as high a standard as club in Jamaica, and the Lancashire Tourist Board will be gunning for me after saying this. It was forever raining. Almost everywhere I went, outfield was wet. The wickets were wet. The run-ups were wet. We had to put loads of sawdust down because you couldn't keep your footing when running in. So it was far from comfortable for a fast bowler like myself. I developed a niggle in my ankle as a result. I remember turning up for an away game once, and for the entire week before the weekend it had been nice and sunny. I thought, finally, I'd get a dry pitch. But when I got there, the square was soaking wet. Now, Lancashire is not such a wet county that the rains come from under your feet, so I think someone must have said, hey, that holding will be here on Saturday. Get the sprinklers out. The only time I can remember when it wasn't soaking was a home game against Lower House, and I got tons of wickets, 7 or 8, for very little. The pitch was dry and hard and the batsmen couldn't handle it. Lovely. Still, the experience of the people and the whole Lancashire scene was well worth it. The first game we were supposed to play was snowed off, an incredible sight for a lad who had grown up in the heat of Jamaica. I had seen snow before, but I'd never walked through it. I'm pleased I never had to bowl through it too. That weekend, Andy Roberts was playing for a team at a ground close to Rishton, so Wilf Woodhouse and I jumped into the car and went over to where he was playing. It was at East Lancs, a bigger and more well-off club than Rishton. They had better facilities, pitch covers and the like. Amazingly, they were playing because they had cleared all the snow from the outfield and piled it high at the edges to form the boundary. I couldn't believe it. When I went to see Andy in the dressing room, he was huddled up by the electric heaters with what seemed like about 5 sweaters on and no doubt some long johns underneath. Good old Wilf had to lend me a pair of gloves and a huge winter coat because foolishly, coming to England in the summer, I didn't think I needed any. But then again, this was April in Lancashire. I now know a lot more about weather conditions in England. Wilf did everything to make me as comfortable as possible. So too did Eric Whaley, who was the captain at the time, and he ended up as the chairman of the famous soccer team, Accrington Stanley, taking them back into the Football League. There was Frank, the wicket-keeper, also the local butcher, who joked about playing with stakes in his gloves when standing back to me, and Betty, our most loyal supporter, whose criticism or support could be heard from the other side of the ground. The people made it for me, in a small community that had folks who would turn up to cheer us at home or away. It was a nice, comfortable, warm community. Even to this day, occasionally, I run across people from Rishton when I work at Old Trafford, and it's always good to catch up for a chat. With so much spare time in the week, Clive Lloyd, who was captain in Lancashire at the time, suggested I turn out for them in the odd county championship game or Sunday league match. This was my first look at England's county circuit, and it prepared me for my stint with Derbyshire later on. Jack Simmons, who went on to become chairman of Lancashire, used to come and pick me up in his car, and we formed a relationship that remained strong. He lived in Accrington, which was close to Rishton. So we would travel together when we played for Lancashire. Sometimes we had some long drives from up north to some distant southern venues, but they were never boring with Jack. Coming back from matches, we'd stop at a pub, and Jack would always have his steak and kidney pie with mushy peas or fish and chips with mushy peas. He loved his food, and he was always trying to get me to eat the local fare. I would venture into fish and chips, but I couldn't handle those mushy peas. I understand that these days Rishton has much better pitch covers to keep the rain off. A few years later, after my spell with them, they signed some guy called Viv Richards, and apparently crowds and bar takings went through the roof. It was Jack who organised for me to go to play for Tasmania in the 1982-1983 Australia domestic season. He had essentially become my agent, sorting out my contracts and making sure I would be looked after, although he never charged me for this help. Jack and David Hughes, another Red Rose stalwart, would go down to Australia and play every winter in Tasmania. When Tasmania were accepted into the Sheffield Shield for the first time, they were allowed 2 overseas players, while the rest of the states were allowed 1. Jack got myself and Roland Butcher as the 2 to play for the Tassies in their first season. I was coming back from an operation on my knee at the time, so I wasn't even sure I was going to be that fit. I needn't have worried. I performed well and had an absolute ball. Early on, we went to Sydney to play the great New South Wales and won. It was a massive achievement for Tasmania, the new boys of Australian state cricket, to beat such a fearsome and well-established team. Our manager, Mr. Carey, sat staring disbelievingly into space after that victory. The old Tassie had done it. We had a few drinks in the dressing room after the victory, revealing, in fact, that no one had given us a prayer. David Boone was a young man in that Tasmanian team, and he showed that he was just warming up in terms of run scoring and an ability to sink a few tinies. For someone who didn't like bad weather, I guess I picked some cold places away from home to ply my trade, but really the attraction of playing for Tasmania was purely the chance to go back to Australia, a wonderful country. Besides, it didn't hit me that I'd be away from the warm weather. I was actually based in Launceston instead of the capital, Hobart, which was something of a blessing. It wasn't as chilly as Hobart, because it was sheltered from the icy breeze that rushed in from the sea. I kept on boasting that Launceston was always at least 1 degree warmer than Hobart. It was no Sydney or Melbourne, though. My move to Tasmania raised a lot of eyebrows. Not as many as when I signed for Derbyshire, though, who were not considered one of the most fashionable counties. A lot of people asked me why I went to Derby. It was simple. They asked me to. Since I turned down Sussex, no county had come in for me. And even though Lancashire were interested about the same time, they were offering less money, so I was hardly likely to be biting off their hand. When I was down in Tassie, Jeff Dusty Miller, who played for Derbyshire and was on duty down under for England in the Ashes, approached me to see if I was interested in playing for them in the summer of 1983. I knew and trusted Dusty from early skirmishes between England and the West Indies, so I was happy to chat about it all. Plus, he was at Derbyshire himself. What I knew from 7 first-class matches with Lancashire in 1981 was that county cricket was a long, hard slog. I didn't fancy playing 16 county championship games, another 16 Sunday league games, and then a handful of 50 more matches. I would not have been in the best shape, to say the least. I suggested that I play half the county games and all the one-day matches. Derbyshire agreed. I was at the stage of my career when I was able to dictate terms, so I was happy with the way things turned out. The first season, I played just the 6 first-class matches plus one-day games, because that was the year of the Third World Cup, which consumed the early part of the summer. This tournament may not have only consumed the early part of the 1983 summer, but it consumed me and my West Indies teammates for the whole of that summer and many years after, in fact. Having won the tournament in 1975 and 1979, we were hot favourites for the hat-trick. Unfortunately, we made the cardinal sin of underestimating our opponents, India, in the final at Lord's, and they produced one of the great shocks of all time because they were not actually a very good one-day side. Boy, there were recriminations in our dressing room after that loss. The bowlers blamed the batsmen and vice versa. Poor old Andy Roberts got an ear-bashing from Clive Lloyd because Andy had said it was a shame we lost because players had given their all, even though only half fit. He was referring to me, but Clive thought Andy was criticizing his decision to play when he had a muscle problem. Things got pretty heated, so much so that in the aftermath, Clive announced his resignation before he was persuaded to think it over properly. Thankfully, he carried on. Suffice to say, I was glad to get up to Derby after such a crushing disappointment, one that I felt I would never get over. Time heals, though. I made some great friends at Derbyshire, and it was no coincidence that I went back in 1985 and played every season until 1989. I had a great relationship with Kim Barnett, who was the skipper. He respected fast bowlers and knew you couldn't bowl them into the ground. He kept me fresh. There was also the added joy of playing and making friends with fellow West Indian fast bowlers, either by birth or heritage: Alan Warner, Martin Jean-Jacques, Frankie Griffiths, and, of course, Devon Malcolm. Devon, born in Jamaica, was probably the most well-known of the quartet. I would talk to Dev quite a bit about bowling fast. I've always believed in trying to get into people's heads instead of interfering with technical things. If I went into the nets with Dev, it was only ever to work on a slight technical adjustment, because his action was not the sort you could mould or change to something more orthodox. He needed to be told what his strengths were and what he needed to do to be successful. Phil Russell, the coach, and Kim believed that he could do a great deal of damage with his pace. They were proved right, with his most potent spell being when he ran through South Africa at the Oval in 1984. He had a good career, playing 40 tests for England, and of course the great memory of Nelson Mandela labelling him the Destroyer. Not a bad story to tell. Oh, and I must not forget the Great Dane, Ollie Mortensen. Naturally, we call him Stan or Bloodaxe if he was in one of his fiery moods. We opened the bowling together, although I was considerably quicker. Stan could let his frustration get the better of his emotion if things weren't going to plan, and he was known to scream and shout a few things on his way back to his mark or fielding position. The important thing with Stan, however, was that he was never abusive to the opposition. Whatever ranting and raving he did was for his benefit, and he controlled himself enough to do a good job for Derbyshire, where he is still loved and respected. We are still in touch, and in fact he came over for a wedding in the summer of 2009. He popped into Lord's for a day of cricket and went out for dinner with Beefy and some other friends and had a great time. The only disappointing aspect of playing for Derby was the fact our team wasn't all that good. Halfway through a season we'd be out of all the competitions, and it became hard to motivate yourself. In the 1988 season we got to the final of the Benson and Hedges Cup to play Hampshire, but we were victims of batting first in a Lord's final when the ball would bend around corners in helpful conditions. We made only 117 and had no hope of defending it. Most seasons, though, we were out of everything by July, and the last 2 months were a bit of a drag. The culture off the field in cricket in general surprised me. In 1989, I was quoted as saying that county cricketers lived off a diet of burgers and fast food. They didn't look after themselves at all. As far as fitness levels are concerned, it was like going back in time to my early days with Jamaica. There was no team warm-up. Everyone just did their own thing. I would be doing a few laps of the field and sometimes stretches to get ready, but everyone else was in the nets, reckoning a bit of bat and ball would be enough. Too many players were in a comfort zone, and they were more than happy to remain there. All the batsmen talked about was scoring thousands of runs a season, because that almost guaranteed a new contract for their county. That was all they aimed for, rather than getting out of their comfort zone, eating right, doing the fitness work, and getting into those nets. In my mind, a lot of players didn't even go out to try to do their best every game. Against me, Sylvester Clarke or Joel Garner, they were quite happy to get out cheaply, because the next week they knew they'd be up against the less fearsome bowler, and they could get the century they needed to keep the 1,000-run target on track. No problem. That would be good to keep their numbers up. County cricket needed people to bust a gut and say, hey, I'm good enough for England and I'll play for them. John Morris was one of those county cricketers I saw who should have achieved a lot more than he did. He was at Derby, so I saw a lot of him. He was a supremely talented batsman and should have scored a lot more runs for England. But he didn't seem to me to have the desire to do the hard work necessary to achieve those goals. And when he was picked for his country, he got into trouble with a certain Mr. D. Gower in a tiger moth plane in Australia in 1991. The good thing about John, though, was he didn't shirk his responsibilities when he came up against the big gun bowlers in the opposition team. He wanted to prove his abilities against them. I can remember one battle in particular against the great Richard Hadley when he was at Nottingham that John won, and it was a pleasure to sit in the dressing room and watch him bat. The professionalism at county level has improved to a degree through the money available to England players. Players at the highest level can make a seriously good living, and the difference in salaries is a lot greater than years ago. So county players see that and aspire to it. In the 1980s, particularly the early years, the general feeling of malaise around county cricket was blamed for England's poor performances on the international scene. I'd agree with this view. England struggled because players were satisfied with mediocrity, satisfied with their 1,000 runs or 50 wickets a season and hanging on grimly for the benefit of payday. After all, the difference in financial rewards wasn't that great, and county cricket was a lot more comfortable and with less exposure to the national press. But I would also say, and this was possibly a truth, that the English found hard to accept, that there just weren't very many good players around. My one season with Canterbury in New Zealand came about through a Derbyshire connection. John Wright was a teammate of mine at Derby and also a keen adversary for clashes between West Indies and New Zealand, when he was always a key wicket. As I played only half the season, Wrighty played the other half, so we were job sharing. He also loved his horses, as did Kim Barrett, so we were on common ground. He asked me if I wanted to play for Canterbury in 1987-1988, although we would never actually play together because he was always with New Zealand in Australia for almost the entire season. It was another great experience, totally different to the one when I first toured there with the West Indies, when the deplorable umpiring drove me and my teammates up the wall. I got a lot more involved with the people, as I was now representing the state instead of being a visiting adversary who was just there to try to beat the opposition and head home. I had a different image of New Zealand after that, and I'm glad I went back. They say first impressions are long-lasting, but the second visit eased the pain of that West Indies tour. The people were great, and I just loved the Canterbury countryside. It was very green, and I got myself a car and would drive around, taking in the scenery. The mountains, snow-capped all year round, were a tremendous sight. Graham Hick was down there with Northern Districts at the time, the great white hope for English cricket, or so he was billed. Hick always looked good, there's no doubt about that. He was a very talented batsman. It just seemed to me that whenever the pressure was on, he didn't stand up. I remember, even in that first season, he'd made a name for himself in England. Gone to New Zealand, and all the television cameras and press turned up for his debut. He got a duck. Of all the domestic cricket I played in England, Australia and New Zealand, I would not hesitate to say that the Sheffield Shield was the toughest. It was so much stronger than the county game or the Kiwi scene. In England, I've always maintained that the talent is spread too thinly over too many sides. In New Zealand, the best players were away with the national side, but in Australia, the test players were always available. In the Caribbean, the domestic scene was keenly fought, and those wins are among my happiest memories of all the teams I played for. We won the Red Stripe Cup in the first 2 years, 1988 and 1989. Jamaica had been starved of success for 21 years, so when we claimed the first of those titles, the island went crazy. It was apt that the new sponsors of the competition was a great Jamaican beer, and it certainly flowed on a lap of honour that lasted a weekend, stopped at every town and village around the island, and made the open-top bus parade that FA Cup winning teams go on look lame by comparison. Caribbean cricket is nothing like the other domestic competitions because it is not county versus county or state versus state, but nation versus nation. It is fierce, often feral. Whenever on a tour with the West Indies that was coming to an end, the players couldn't help but think about the battles ahead with their island teams. Jibes would start to flow and guys taunted each other, threatening total annihilation when one island visited the other. The Bajans would be shouting to the Jamaicans, "You wait till you get to Barbados," or the Guyanese telling the Trinis, "Guyana versus Trinidad is going to be spicy." It was all in jest, but when you got out onto the fields for those games like that, It was a serious business. Malcolm Marshall came with Barbados to Sabina Park one year. He got some fearful stick. He was naturally a threat to the Jamaica batting lineup and obviously pivotal to the outcome of the game. The crowd got on his case early on. They told him straight, "When you're playing for Barbados, we don't like you. When you're with the West Indies, we'll cheer and clap and be happy. But not this time around." This was the feeling when it was island versus island. Fierce, very proud people. My final first-class match in the Caribbean was against Barbados at Kensington Oval. We needed a draw to win the 1989 championship, and we duly got it. Not that I helped a great deal with the bat. I was out, off the bowling of Desmond Haynes, would you believe, who couldn't stop laughing as I made my way to the pavilion for the last time. As you may have guessed, since Desi was bowling, fortunately, by this time, the draw had already been guaranteed and the job done.
Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why, oh, why, oh, why? Hey, no holding back.
Michael Holding, No Holding Back, the autobiography. Chapter 11. Time to go. By the time of the 1986-87 tour to Australia and New Zealand, my career had come full circle. I had, of course, made my first international appearance for West Indies down under in 1975 and had such a miserable time with players, forming cliques and backbiting, that I considered quitting for good. Well, when it all happened again, more than 10 years later, with me being a wise old sage at the age of 33, not to mention not quite the tearaway fast bowler that I used to be, I was sure that this time I had had enough. I wanted out of international cricket. We were to play 2 one-day tournaments in Australia before heading off to New Zealand for 3 test matches and another series of ODIs. The tour started badly, and I got worse. Firstly, we flew to Australia on a Christmas Eve night, so we arrived in Perth on Christmas morning. Can you imagine players agreeing to that these days? The mood was not enhanced when we discovered that Viv Richards, the new captain after replacing the retired Clive Lloyd, had been allowed by the board to spend Christmas at home before flying out later. Hardly a boost for team morale. Already you can see the similarities between this tour and my first, a new captain learning on the job, just as Clive had been, about how to deal with the individuals and the discipline of the group as a whole. Clive didn't get the balance right on his first tour, so it was not a surprise that Viv didn't quite manage it either. At the time, I believe much of the difficulty surrounded one of our senior players, Gordon Greenwich. Gordon was struggling with a knee injury, and he wanted a rest, saying he was stale from so much cricket. He was essentially refusing to play on fitness grounds, but we were desperate for his experience. Desmond Haynes was out with a broken finger for a World Series Cup game against England in Devonport, Tasmania, a game we had to win to qualify for the finals. We had grown accustomed to Gordon and his injuries, but it was unusual for him to not play at all. He was famous for limping and hobbling around at the crease, so much so that it had become a joke. I remember once in Sydney that Gordon was limping so much it looked as though his leg had fallen off. Andy Roberts, whose cousin was married to Gordon, said, "I'd love to see him if this building ever caught fire." And by the way, they used to say that when Gordon Greenwich started limping, bowlers should watch out. That was no myth. He truly was at his most dangerous whenever he appeared to be struggling. Under normal circumstances, team members would have just ignored him and got on with playing. But this time around, there was some mutual animosity between him and the rest of the team. It was simply because we were losing and needed his skill and experience. We were beaten 7 times in 11 one-day matches in Australia. It was hardly the ratio we were used to, and our problems were a big story in Australia, with the locals baffled by our change in fortunes. When the newspapers started to revel in our demise, players of injuries, and there is lots of squabbling in the camp. It is hard to break that cycle. As a result, players lose focus on their cricket and turn their attention to some of the other activities that a country like Australia can offer. That is the challenge of touring. I found it all immensely frustrating because I was vice-captain but powerless. For example, Viv, Steve Camacho, the manager, and myself were the tour selectors, and we had to make the decision as to whether Gordon was fit enough to go to New Zealand at the end of the Australian leg. We agreed he was not, and although he was a very fine player, that he should go home. He hadn't been fit to play in Australia, and there was no point in him limping around in New Zealand as well. So I was surprised that Gordon did come to New Zealand, having left the meeting under the impression that a replacement would be called for. I was pretty fed up. There was no camaraderie among the guys to lift me or anyone else out of the gloom, and that was not how cricket tours should be. I even seem to remember a couple of guys coming close to fighting each other over some trifling matter. Discipline had broken down. I called the chairman of selectors, Jackie Hendricks, back in Jamaica and told him that I wasn't comfortable with what was happening. Certain cliques were being formed within the team, and that I wanted him to take the vice-captaincy away from me. I argued that vice-captaincy on tours was a very responsible position, and that, with what was happening around me, I didn't feel motivated enough to put in the effort required for the job. In other words, I just wanted to complete the tour as an ordinary player without any extra responsibilities and call it a day at the end. By this stage, I knew this would be my last tour, and I just wanted to go out there and try to take wickets without any responsibility of making sure so-and-so were getting along okay, or this guy wasn't sulking, or what have you. It was probably not the ideal way to go about it. I don't want to say it was the cowardly thing to do, but probably selfish was the right word. I just feel that I was powerless to do anything about our problems. However, Hendricks didn't let me give up the role. He thought the team needed my support. Since it was my last tour, he thought I may as well keep it. My exit from the international stage came quicker than I expected, though. We had muddled through the one-day action in Australia and had headed out to New Zealand with many of the issues still unresolved. During the first test, I developed a back strain. It was nothing too serious, just a twinge, and I spoke to Dennis Waite about the injury. Not a problem, he told me. You'll be back in time for the one-day series at the end of the tour. Well, I didn't get into cricket to play one-day matches. I enjoyed them, and I played in them because they were there. But Test cricket was what it was all about. So, if I was not going to be fit, I thought, it best that I go home and let someone else have a go. It was not a serious injury at all. It was just a little strain from perhaps landing badly on a delivery, and could easily have happened in my first test as much as my last. I suppose what I was trying to say is that the injury played no part in my decision to retire. It just brought it forward by a couple of tests. I didn't think, I just can't go through another rehabilitation period, because it would not have been a long, painstaking process, a train of thought which many players have cited down the years for their decision to call it a day. I had become used to these sorts of niggling injuries because I was not a big, strong, powerful guy, and trying to bowl fast with a reasonably light frame would always involve a few injuries along the way. I lasted as long as I did because of my nice, smooth action, which didn't take a lot out of me. I got a knee injury, lateral cartilage removal, back in 1981-82, right after a series against Australia, and had it operated on in February 1982. Also, I had shoulder problems through a torn rotary cup in 1976, but otherwise, most of my knocks were pretty minor. The niggle I got in the first test in New Zealand, which happened to have started 4 days after my birthday, was just another small one. It just made me think that I may as well go straight away as opposed to waiting until the end of the series. I went to Steve Camacho in the dressing room after I'd come off the field and told him, "Dennis says the injury's not going to heal to play the rest of the test, and I think it's better for me to retire. Go home and you can find a replacement." Steve was shocked at how blunt I was being over such a big decision. "Mikey," "Are you sure about this? Think about it for a while." I told him I'd been thinking about it for a couple of years. In fact, I'd wanted to retire back in 1985. Jackie Hendricks had convinced me not to. West Indies were going to Pakistan, and he told me to miss that tour, to think about things, and then only pack up if I still felt the same. I carried on because that time off refreshed me, so it was no spur-of-the-moment thing. "I think I need to go home," I repeated to Steve. He knew I was serious then. We were not tucked away in the corner of the dressing room whispering to each other, but talking about it openly. Some players could hear what we were saying, and the rest heard about my decision later. I was never one for big announcements, so I certainly didn't stand up in front of the guys and make a speech. "Excuse me, gentlemen, I've got something to say." No, not me at all. The news just filtered out. Steve made the arrangements for me to go home. I was happy about the circumstances, if you can be happy about something like that. I went to New Zealand with 249 wickets and walked out of Test cricket with 249 wickets. I didn't bowl well enough in my last Test to take a wicket, although that had a bit to do with the injury, just like I didn't bowl well enough in my first to get one in Brisbane in 1975. Full circle. After it was finally confirmed and made public that I had retired and was heading home from New Zealand, I was extremely thankful that I did not take that wicket to get me to 250. That may sound strange, but I am happy that I did not get a wicket, because in the end people would have said that I only went on that tour to get to or past the landmark. I didn't want that thrown in my face. When I jumped on that plane, the overriding emotion I felt was not one of sadness or despair. It was pure relief. It was all over. No more training runs, which initially were enjoyable but had become a bind and only done because it was necessary. No more pounding in for over after over, and certainly no more having to listen to pathetic squabbling from teammates. Never did I worry that I would miss the game. I wasn't enjoying it anymore. That was the bottom line. It was a similar position when I retired from first-class cricket. I played 2 more years with Derbyshire and Jamaica after retiring from internationals. I knew it was the end when one morning in Derby I got out of bed at home and went to the curtains. Pulling them back, I felt deep down inside that I was hoping that it would be dark, raining, with little chance of play. When I caught myself doing that, I said to myself, if this is how you feel about the job you're doing, then don't do it. I don't believe in doing something that you're dreading doing. You've got to look forward to a job when you're getting out of bed in the morning. I think this feeling comes to fast bowlers more quicker than it does to batsmen. Bowling quick is hard work physically and mentally, and we bowlers were always clambering out of bed feeling an ache or pain somewhere. I often found that I was going into a game nowhere near as fit as I'd have liked. That took its toll mentally and physically. So I was ready for both retirements, international and first class. Not that most of the people on the street agreed, but then they rarely do. In the 10 years after I packed up, people kept telling me I retired too quickly. My answer was, better to leave early and to be told so by fans than to hang around too long for those same people to say, what you still doing here? Never overstay your welcome. The timing was fine. West Indies still had a lot of fast bowlers to choose from. Malcolm Marshall was at the top of his game. Joel Gardner was on that tour. There was Tony Gray, who replaced me in New Zealand, plus Patrick Peterson, Courtney Walsh and Winston Davis. So there were quite a few guys who could carry the mantle. I was not leaving a team whose cupboard would have been bare without me. Of course, Courtney went on to play 132 tests for West Indies, taking a fantastic 519 wickets in a career spanning an incredible 17 years. He is probably the most durable fast bowler there has ever been. Not bad for a guy who I remember as a kid in Jamaica. We came from the same club and are both still members, who started off bowling leg breaks. I first thought of retiring when Clive Lloyd retired, and I suppose I felt that I should go at the same time. He was such a huge influence on me, and when he was no longer around, something wasn't quite right. We had been through a lot together, and I owed him my career. He was the guy who believed in me enough to pick me as a bowler who had only shown promise. He thought of me in 1977 when I hadn't been actually playing, got me into World Series cricket, and he was the man, of course, who led us to such great success on the field. I've already said this, but Clive was a father figure. When I carried on playing for a couple more years without him, it simply wasn't the same. I was enjoying it to a degree, yes, but it wasn't the same feeling. Although Clive had been incredibly inspirational, it wasn't a case of not being able to raise my game or go at full tilt anymore. My motivation was the West Indian people who relied on you lifting their lives, and this was always stronger than anything an individual could say or do. It is hard to explain what it is like with Clive no longer in charge. The comparison shouldn't be taken too literally, but it sort of illustrates what I'm trying to say. In life, your parents die and life goes on, but it has a different feel. You still have to go out and do whatever you did before, but it's different. It was also important that West Indies moved on from Clive, for Viv Richards to move on with his own team. Viv said in his first team meeting, "Clive is gone. I'm the captain. I'll do it my way." It wasn't said to mean that any politics in place would drastically change, just that he was a different personality and things would be different. Viv became a very successful captain, but he was a completely different type of captain, and it was something of a culture shock. Viv was very competitive, just as Clive was, but it manifested itself in his reactions to anything below the standard he expected. He wasn't as understanding as Clive. Viv wouldn't accept some of the frailties that Clive put up with as far as performance was concerned. Viv was such a good player and so fiercely competitive that he initially found it difficult to contain his emotions when mistakes were made. Of course, Clive was also very talented, but he knew players would make mistakes. It was part of the game, and he controlled his emotions accordingly, at least the vast majority of the time. But despite their differences, both were great managers. Indeed, Viv has a brilliant record as a captain, but sometimes Viv's temper could get the better of him. I would see him come down so hard on some youngsters, especially those from Antigua, his homeland, that they would struggle. It was almost as if they were disappointing him, and he had to let them know. When you're a young, impressionable guy and someone like Viv is telling you off, it's natural to think he doesn't like you or he's picking on you. It was not the case. In fact, the opposite. He wanted them to do well really badly. It's a bit like when I'm commenting, and I'm very hard on West Indies. It's not because I don't like them, but I still feel a part of West Indies, and when they don't do well, you can't be too harsh. Their success still means a lot. You're upset, and you're not taking a totally neutral view. That was happening with Viv. His emotions were getting involved with the players not living up to expectations. I'm not talking over a whole career. It was in an instance. A drop catch, bat over, misfield, a poor shot, little things like that. It was hard having been used to Clive, but I told myself, as he grows in the job, it will change. Viv's emotions didn't affect me too much because I was a senior man. I saw how the youngsters reacted to the pressure they were under and that sort of thing. However, one instance of this did involve me. In Gujranwala in 1985, when we were playing a one-day international against Pakistan, Imran Khan was batting and he was taking the game away from us, whacking the ball toward corners. Joe Garner was bowling and he was going for a few boundaries, so Viv gave me a nod to replace him. We had a packed leg side field, maybe a 5-4 split with Viv at short mid-wicket. My first ball was on the legs and Imran just whipped it away, going over Viv's head and bisecting the fielders on the boundary for 4. Well, Viv had a look on his face that sort of said, "Oh, so you're going to bowl rubbish too then?" I didn't want to bowl to a heavy leg side. I wanted it changed, and I motioned to Viv to switch it. But he still had this look on his face and was completely ignoring me. So I just stood there, with hands on hip, at the end of my mark, not budging. Effectively, I was refusing to bowl until he took notice of me. It was a bit of a standoff, but in the end he relented and came over to discuss the change. This time, we went for an offside bias. Next ball, Imran sliced straight into Robert Harper at backward point, and he took the catch. Clive and the cliques in the team were not the sole reasons for my retirement. Thanks to my age, the niggles I'd suffered, and my reduced run-up, I was down to 75 to 80% from my peak in terms of effectiveness. That was hard to reconcile. I was not the bowler who destroyed England at the Oval anymore. Jeff Boycott called me the Rolls-Royce of fast bowlers, but I was by now a considerably less grand machine. At this stage, I wasn't going into a test thinking, I'll take 5 or 6 in this test. I was no longer a lead bowler. Indeed, I was second change in the first test against New Zealand. This was not something I wanted to be, and I didn't look forward to doing it. How do I look back on the career I had? I have never really thought about it very much. I'm not one who sits at home and pores over old scorecards reminiscing how I got so-and-so out. I haven't even got a cricket picture on any wall at home, and I don't look up old footage on YouTube. I was even reluctant to write about the greatest over. I was never even someone who thought about my career when I was playing, apart from taking my wickets to make sure I was selected. I was only around to help the team and to help West Indies do as best as they could. I wasn't focused on me. That's why I was so glad I didn't get the 250th wicket. I didn't want people to think I thought it was about me. Actually, that's the only time I do hark back at my career to remember how fortunate I was that I didn't achieve that figure. It was all about the team, and there were many memorable team results. The World Cup win in 1979 was great. It was the first time I was involved in a world tournament. But Test cricket was the ultimate, and I cherish memories of being part of a team that was the best in the world. The highlight was probably winning in Australia 2-0 in the 3 Test series in 1979-1980. It was all the more special as it took place on our first tour back in traditional cricket after Packer. It was also the first time West Indies had ever won a Test series in Australia, or even won more than a single Test. We played such great cricket too. In Melbourne, we were dominant, winning by 10 wickets, and in Adelaide, we were more so. The 408-run margin victory was at the time the 6th biggest win in terms of runs. It is still number 8 today. I do recognize that I was a lucky sort to have lived the life of a cricketer. Being part of a great team made a big difference. We earned a lot of respect all over the world. We'd go to Australia and have the Australians wanting West Indies to beat their team because they loved the way we played. When that happens, you think, hell, that's great. When you can turn home supporters, that's some power. I'm not talking about the odd few. I'm talking about thousands. The guys would joke about our charmed existence, this spoilt life, how we'd wake up in the morning in a fine hotel, shower, disappear out of the room to play cricket or go shopping, and when we got back, everything was spick and span, the bathroom cleaned, beds made. As kids in the Caribbean, when we got up in the morning, we couldn't go out to play until the bed was made and other household chores were completed, parents watching over us. We knew it wouldn't last forever, but we made hay while the sun shined.
Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why, oh, why, oh, why? Hey, no holding back.
Michael Holding, No Holding Back, the autobiography.
Time, yeah. So this is Abchal Street and Spanish Town Road, and then down there say you call Miles Drugstore. You have Justin, and there say you call Charles Street. Yeah, that little lane you call it Charles Street, and you have Charles Street. Then you have Wellington Street. You have Pink Lane, and going up more, furthermore. To the other side you call it Queens, where it used to be a theater show. Right now it's a hangout spot where all elders hang out and play them domino. Them little loody. Yeah. To be West Garden, yeah man. Tivoli Garden, you say Okay. Right now over there so it's Tivoli Garden. Otherwise, Set Me Free. Yeah, the party vibes. Yeah, don't know. It's all about West Kingston, downtown Kingston. Yeah, the Mafia Corner. Yeah. And over the other side now, you just call it the Chrome Sheller Squad. Yeah. Over there now. You don't know, barber shop, hairdresser, pharmacy. You don't know, hardware, liquor store. Talk about it. Anything do you want to know about in West Kingston, you will get it. Anything.
Chapter 12, On the Gas. I want to use this chapter to say big thanks to the Jamaican people who supported me when they didn't need to, who gave me help when they had nothing to gain from it, and, believe it or not, those who put their lives on the line with no reward coming their way. They did it for me, and when I sit here writing these words, it makes me feel very humble indeed as to the lengths folks went to. Having retired from first-class cricket in 1989, I went back to Jamaica needing to make a living. Many options were considered, but it transpired that I would end up running a petrol station, Michael Holding Service Centre, and it was in this venture that so many people bent over backwards for me. I can't quite recall how I eventually settled on this course of action, but Howard Hamilton, who used to be head of Shell in the Caribbean and a friend of the family since he went to the same school as my sisters, was the catalyst. Howard and I become pretty close. He took an active part in cricketing matters in the Caribbean because Shell sponsored the regional Shell Shield tournament in which the island's region competed for first-class honours, and so formed friendships with many Caribbean cricketers. As time went on over my playing career, we became very good friends and even part-owned horses together. I either went to him with the idea or he suggested it to me. Either way, the timing was perfect because there was this Shell station in New Kingston that the gentleman running it was looking to sell. There was a lot of positive vibes in the move. The gentleman was Alwyn Miller, an ex-Kingston College student like myself, and Howard helped me to negotiate with him to buy the station. I took over the accounts a few months before the first Gulf War, and immediately the price of petrol went sky high. The windfall was instantaneous because although the purchase price went up, the actual markup to arrive at the selling price was a percentage of the purchase price, not a flat amount. It wasn't a bad time to take over the business. What an easy lark this is, I reckon naively. At the time there was another gentleman, Guy Morris, who also had a Shell petrol station and was also a big cricket fan. He offered to help me set up the business. I sat down with him at the station with our representative managers to go through the business before the formalities were completed. Step by step, he taught me how to run the show, the system, how everything should tally up, and what I had to do with the books. When I started, he even went on to lend me a couple of his staff to train mine because they were brand new to the business. Guy did not have to do that for me. After all, it could be argued that we were rival stations, as we were not separated by more than a handful of miles. By the time we went into full swing at Michael Holding Service Centre, my full complement of staff numbered 12. It was at the time when each pump needed an attendant. Most of them came from Melbourne Cricket Club, where I played my favourite cricket and remain a member for life. We had a lot of youngsters from the area who didn't have jobs, and so I brought them on board because I knew they were reputable people I had 2 girls there as well, who were the children of the first helper that I had look after my youngest daughter, Tiana. Pearl, as she is known, loved Tiana. Tiana loved her, and she was someone we could trust implicitly. I took them on because I knew Pearl and her family had to be good people. They all worked hard for me, and we had a great relationship. Of course, over the years I employed some people who I did not know, and inevitably some of them didn't last in the job. Suffice to say, when there is cash around, the temptation can be too great for some to endure. It was hard, rewarding work, often non-stop too. For the first 8 or 9 months at the station, I spent 18 hours a day there. I was there morning, noon and night. The only day I wasn't there the entire time was on Sunday. On weekends, Monday through to Saturday, we would have 2 8-hour shifts, and they would overlap, starting at 7 a.m. I had to get there before the first shift, and I was there when the second ended at 10 p.m. On Sunday, we just had 1 8-hour shift starting at 8 a.m. Before the day's sales started, the level of petrol in the underground tanks had to be measured, correlated. When that had been measured the night before, when locking up at the end of the day, measured again. The difference then to correlate to the volume of petrol sold according to the records of the attendants. Not all reconciliation was done that night, but my office work didn't end for me the moment the pumps outside were shut off. I remember one New Year's Eve with the same supposed 10 o'clock lock-off time. I was trying to close the station to get back home to be with friends and family, but I couldn't. Cars just kept pulling in. We closed the majority of the pumps, but each time I even attempted to close down the final pump, in would come another car, because they knew it would be their last chance of petrol for a couple of days. I got frustrated that night, but that was the nature of the business, and the staff who were there just rolled along with what was happening. Eventually I got a break and closed the remaining pumps, rushed inside and turned off the outside lights, and got down to the bit of paperwork necessary before we could all head home. I would usually drop home as many of the staff as I could each night, as getting public transport that late wasn't easy. That night none of us got home before midnight, so I wasn't able to say cheers and Happy New Year, but those were the sacrifices I had to make. It was nothing in comparison to the ones the Jamaican people made for me. Michael Holding's service centre was at a very awkward spot on the corner of Trafalgar Road and Knutsford Boulevard, which formed the T-junction, with Trafalgar Road forming the cross of the T, making it difficult to get into the station. Drivers heading east on Trafalgar Road would have to cross 2 lanes of traffic heading west to fill up. Those heading north on Knutsford Boulevard had to turn right heading east onto Trafalgar Road, then cross the 2 lanes heading west to get into the station. There were a lot of accidents, the sound of the crunch of metal being such a regular occurrence that after a while it stopped making me jump out of my chair. Sometimes the car turning into the station would start to make its way across, because the car on the outside lane west would stop, but the person on the inside wouldn't, and not being able to see in front of the stopped car, they would collide. Believe me, I can't say that I would be risking going into a station 3 or 4 times a month if that was the problem. It was not only the bodywork of their cars that the Jamaicans risked. Some people put their lives on the line. With all the cash involved, I would have to go to the bank every night to deposit the takings. A risky operation, no matter where in the world you worked. But again, people came good. I had a friend in the police force who used to visit me before I could afford to hire a security company to deal with the money. This guy would wait for me every night and make sure I got to the bank safe and sound. Eventually, he was transferred from Kingston to St. Thomas and was no longer able to be my personal security guard. But do you know what he did? He called a colleague of his and told him, "You've got to help Mikey." I had never met this guy, but every night he was there without fail. We formed a great friendship. He would come before the station closed, have a chat, and then escort me to the bank. And if I wanted him to follow me home, he would do that too. Above and beyond the call of duty, that's what you could call it. There was no need for those guys to do that, and they never asked me for a dime. We never knew if there would be a man with a gun waiting for us to lock up and then strike, making off with the takings or worse. I won't mention the names of these two policemen because I'm not sure they would want me to. But gents, you know who you are, and thanks again. It was amazing. I knew that I had done reasonably well at cricket and had grown accustomed to people calling out to me in the street, either those that I knew personally or those who just recognized me passing by. But that's about as far as I expected the relationship to go. With some, it went a lot further. Possibly their help was because I'd given them pleasure through my cricket, and maybe they were repaying me. Not that I needed it, for I certainly enjoyed it myself. I played for successful teams, and I guess people get attached to you because you've given them joy. But that doesn't mean they're going to take risks for you like those policemen did. Overall, I would say I had no regrets about running the gas station. It was a great learning experience. You can become a little insular or cross-seated as a cricketer. So the benefit of getting back into the real world was huge. Most of all, I learned about people, how best to manage my staff, and how to treat both staff and customers. They were always right, of course, but sometimes even dealing with some of them was a little trying. For example, the odd person would come into the station and try to do something that would make you think, why? Somebody with a business account approached me once to do what is called double invoicing. I was supposed to supply 2 invoices for petrol and services rendered. One was a correct invoice that would be paid, and the other would be much higher for them to use to claim back on income tax. There was no way I was going to get involved with such a scheme because I didn't want people knocking on my door. I advised the account holder as such, and to be honest, there was no argument from the person, no hard feelings held. The situation was accepted and never mentioned again. I guess it was just someone trying to see how far I was willing to go to help them with their endeavors. Episodes like that certainly opened my eyes to the business world and taught me a few things about human nature. I also learned what real strenuous work was. I thought fast bowling was tough on the body, but this was real stress, physically and mentally. As I mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time on site in the formative years, and the hours were draining. It wasn't always rosy as it first seemed when I first started either. Running a petrol station has its trials and tribulations. For example, finding that you're selling less petrol than you supposedly bought. Once when things were not going well, I can remember going to see one of the supervisors at Shell who would be responsible for my station and almost breaking down in front of him because I was finding it so stressful. I then started to do radio, television and commentary work away from Jamaica, and that didn't help either. There is an age-old Jamaican saying that goes something like this: the eyes of the farmer fatten the cow, which simply means the business flourishes the more the owner is around. However, the point came when I could no longer cope. With the commentary career taking off, I was spending less and less time at the station. When I was in England in 1995 working for Sky Sports, I was away for 4 months, and that just wouldn't do for a manager, at least not for me. I wanted to be involved in the station, not just own it and employ people to do the work. To make everything run smoothly, there was a multitude of things that needed to be done, and without me there, it was a bumpy ride. I had a wonderful lady called Miss Wint who worked for me in the office, and in my absence, she was in charge. She was honest and hard-working, but unfortunately, she was too nice. The staff recognized that she would be a soft touch, so those who wanted to took advantage, slacking off from their work. Miss Wint couldn't quite demand the respect she deserved. On that Sky trip, I called home one day and asked to speak with my mother, just to catch up with the family news and tell them what I was up to. But she wasn't there, and I was told she'd gone down to the gas station. Now, my mother didn't drive and had never held a driver's license in her life, so she hadn't gone to fill up her car. Why is she gone to do that? I asked. I was told that she was down there helping out because of the problems, trying to organize people, checking the books and what have you. That was 1995, so Mum would have been 81. I felt embarrassed and angry that she was having to help me out with my responsibility at such an age. It just wouldn't do, and I made the decision immediately to sell the station. So, by June 1996, Michael Holding Service Centre was no more. Today, there isn't even a gas station on the precarious corner of Trafalgar Road and Knutsford Boulevard. The gentleman I sold it to kept it as a station for a while, but didn't do too well, and it was later sold to a bank who turned it into a parking lot. The bank that bought it has played a large part in my life. It is the same bank where I got my first proper job in the computer center after leaving school. And then I had my personal and business accounts there, as it was in such close proximity to the station. The name had changed over the years from Barclays Bank to the nationalized National Commercial Bank, but it was the same physical structure.
Why, oh, why, hey, no holding back.
Michael Holding, No Holding Back, the autobiography. Chapter 13. Behind the Mic. Grumpiness can often be mistaken for concentration. That was my excuse anyway. On the field of play, my occasional fondness for a furrowed brow and a scowl must have led many watching at home to reckon that I was a miserable so-and-so. I came to that conclusion because the cameramen who were filming those shots told me exactly that. A lot of those same cameramen are still around today, and unfortunately for them, my face is still filling their lines, although in a different guise as a commentator. We used to zoom into you when you were playing, Mikey, and you never looked the happiest, one told me when we were working together for Sky Sports. It really surprised me that off the field you couldn't have been more different. I was glad for such a compliment because the last thing on my mind when I was playing was how I was being perceived by viewers. But the first thing on your mind as a commentator is obviously how you come across. Richie Bennard famously said, "Remember, you're in people's living rooms. Let them feel happy to have you there." Or words to that effect anyway. And I've always respected his opinion on things like that. It would be my hope that in the 21st year as a broadcaster, people no longer think of me as grumpy, although I have been known to get a little cross in the comm box every now and again, and instead that I help people to enjoy the action. It is cliché but true. All broadcasters, whether on radio or television, are guests in people's homes. I am incredibly grateful for their invitation and acceptance. A career in broadcasting came along at just the right time. It allowed me to extricate myself from my gas station business and has given me the financial security that I had hoped for. This may not come as a surprise to you, given the earlier pages about my burgeoning career as a cricketer. But just as I never had an ambition to bowl fast for the West Indies, nor did I have a passion to forge a living as a broadcaster. My timing was perfect as a cricketer in terms of being around at the right time for the Packer Revolution. The same was true as a broadcaster. I was respected enough to be in demand from the likes of Channel 4 and Sky Sports just when a bidding war was underway for the broadcast rights to English cricket. It could all have been so different. After hanging up the bowling boots, I tried my hand at running the gas station and I dabbled with umpiring. Dabbled is the right word because I didn't want to do it professionally. My interest was sparked by my experience as a bowler. I wanted to know what it was like to be the man standing at the wicket with the bowler behind, motionless, focused, and poised to make all decisions. Or, in other words, if you'll excuse me a moment, for slipping into a fast bowler mode with a furrowed brow and scowl, I wanted to know whether it was as hard as some umpires made out. Did it get tiring? Was it boring? Why were so many mistakes made? Throughout my career, I struggled to accept poor decisions, and there was a part of me that was still struggling to comprehend why I didn't get some of those decisions that were so blatantly wrong. For example, in the Sydney Test in 1976 or the infamous one against New Zealand in Dunedin in 1980. The aim was to umpire a few domestic games in Jamaica and to find out for myself how difficult a job it was. To that end, I spoke with Johnny Gale, who was head of the Jamaican Umpires Association, about taking the necessary qualifications. Alas, with the gas station taking up much of my time and a broadcasting career beginning within 14 months of my retirement, I never found the time to excuse all those umpires who had denied my appeals when I was so convinced that I had claimed a wicket. I guess those questions will remain unanswered in my mind. The umpires were let off the hook thanks to a man called Ed Barnes, who worked as a producer for Radio Jamaica, or RJR as it was known. My memory fails me when I try to remember when Ed and I first met, but we got along famously because of a shared love of sports and horse racing in particular. He followed in the footsteps of his older brother Winston, who was among the best broadcasters and radio personalities Jamaica has known, and commented on all the sports, including races at Caymanas Park, a real skill, and we would spend much of our time discussing the sport. During our chats, Ed realized that I was not quite as stern-faced as I was on the field. I supposed he must also have spotted something that he thought would make me a reasonable radio broadcaster. Never have I tried to guess what that was, however. Anyway, Ed asked me whether I fancied having a go at some cricket commentary for RJR. I told him I didn't. I had never thought about doing it, and honestly, I wasn't sure I had the ability. I don't want you to describe the action ball by ball, he told me. I just want you to speak every now and again, giving your analysis of what's happening. In other words, just adding color with my comments in between overs. This argument did not convince me either. I've never done public speaking, I told him, insisting it wasn't for me. Of course, I had public speaking experience of a sort. As a player, I was always happy to do interviews. I often spoke freely, too freely for some as it happens. After the test match against India in Trinidad in 1976, I caused a bit of a stir. India had chased down what was then a world record fourth innings target of 406, and they were cheered on by Indians who had been born and bred in Trinidad. I couldn't understand that and didn't think it was right. Surely they should have been supporting us. I was approached by someone from the press who didn't identify himself and asked for my thoughts. I told him that I felt it was like being in Bombay, and my comment made headlines. Fancy that, me saying exactly what I thought, as way back as 1976. Ed would not take no for an answer. Over the next few days he kept calling me, pestering me to do it. Eventually I relented, And my first spell behind the mic was for the ODI between West Indies and Pakistan and Jamaica on the 12th of March 1988. What had changed my mind? Well, I knew that Ed would be there, as well as my friends Tony Cozier and Reds Pereira, who would be doing all that ball-by-ball stuff. With familiar faces around and people who were very good at their jobs, I thought it wouldn't be too intimidating. I remember being anxious on the first morning, although thinking back to when my debut for Jamaica was spoilt by nerves, it wasn't nearly as bad. Playing sport at a high level helps you deal with pressure, and in relation to performing in front of a large crowd, with all eyes on you expecting you to do something special, speaking into a microphone was much easier. As a matter of fact, on one occasion, when on air I told Tony, I did comment that it was a lot easier in the comms box. His response was a fairly dry, "Well, you should know." Perhaps that is why so many sportsmen have turned to broadcasters. You can still enjoy the sport, but without all that pressure. Frustratingly, I cannot remember any of my pearls from that match. In fact, I had to look up the results. West Indies won by 47 runs. I do recall that Curtly Ambrose made his international debut, but again, time has burnt away the memories of watching a man who went on to take 405 test wickets. I'm pretty sure that my analysis did not include this guy Ambrose. I don't think he has what it takes. I worked for RJR and other radio stations around the Caribbean up until around the millennium, when my dual radio and television commentary got too much and I had to sacrifice one of them. During some test matches, when combining both roles, I barely had time for lunch, and that just wouldn't do. The first stint with RJR, with Ed, Tony and Reds helping me, was immensely enjoyable, and it led to other jobs around the Caribbean. For example, I did commentary for Radio Tempo, a young developing station in Trinidad, which concentrated on regional and cultural events and, of course, sports when international matches were staged on the island. This came about with the help of Reds, who convinced Neil Giuseppe, the manager of the station, to include me in their commentary plans. From there, I got the opportunity to work with other island stations around the Caribbean. Back then, I looked on my commentary work as something as a subsidy to my main job, which was, of course, running my gas station in New Kingston. It was some way off from being a viable career option, since it was very occasional with our short cricket season. If I was approached, I worked. Essentially, I was a freelancer, doing work by the day for around $100 per day on radio before television came along. But if the test matches ended early, some stations only paid for as long as the game lasted. The money was okay, but it wasn't something I relied upon, and those early finishes cost us commentators. In 1990, for the first time, cricket was televised out of the Caribbean to the rest of the world, and TWI was accorded a contract for the production with England, the visitors. It was a historic move because previously there had been just a solitary camera at the ground, with the action only shown on the island where the game was taking place, or in a highlights package for the sports news. Apparently, part of the TWI deal was that they had to have 2 local commentators. Tony Cozier was undoubtedly going to be there, and he recommended that I be the other. Tony was a big name, the voice of cricket in the Caribbean, if you like, having worked for Channel 9, the Australian network, and the BBC. Those rumblings of nerves that I had first experienced when making a debut as a radio commentator returned for one of my earlier appearances on television. This time, they would affect me. My words on the box were gibberish. Tony Gregg was in the anchor role. He did his opening gambit, and then he welcomed me. I said, "Thanks, Tony, and hello to all the..." I was about to say listeners, as my brain automatically went into radio mode, but I managed to stop myself. The problem was the word viewers would not come. I just sat there, open mouth. It was as if it had fallen out of my brain. After a long pause, which to me seemed like an hour, but was probably in all reality just a few seconds, I blurted out, "Watchers." As soon as the word had left my lips, I knew I'd made a fool of myself. You could say there was a bit of a symmetry between my first on-screen appearance, my first match for Jamaica, and my first test for West Indies. On all accounts, I knew I could improve. Crucially, I knew I would be given the time to get better. Never did I get down or depressed that I had not done myself justice. Perhaps the fact that, at the time, it never occurred to me that it could be my profession helped. Not wanting to sound conceited, but I think I have improved. That I have done so has had so much to do with John Galliard, who was a producer for Channel 9 cricket in Australia during those early years and has been a huge influence on my career. John was nicknamed Animal, apparently because his red hair made him look like a cartoon character. I don't know which one, and far be it from me to suggest it might have been the Jim Henson Muppet of the same name. Galliard was in the Caribbean the next year when Australia toured. TWI again was the production company responsible for the pictures, but Channel 9 was responsible for carrying them to the Australian audiences. I again worked on the series, and hence again with John, and as the West Indies were touring Australia that same winter of 1991-1992, he invited me to Australia to work for Channel 9 during the tour. David Gow was also part of the commentary team because Galliard did not believe that a commentary team should only consist of people associated with the playing nations. He wanted people he considered good enough to do the job irrespective of where they were from. The outlook was to have an even greater impact on my life, but that comes later. At Channel 9 I worked with some very experienced and well-respected commentators. Bill Lawry, Richie Bennard, and Ian Chappell, for example. I would sit and listen to those guys while they were on air, trying to pick up as much as possible. Bennard and Chappell in particular, because I spent time with them away from the commentary box as well. Bennard had long been considered the master of cricket commentators, and Chappell was a man I admired and looked up to. That may come as a surprise, bearing in mind our clash in 1976, when he refused to walk, when the whole world except the Empire Ledgwick knew he was out caught behind. But I had great respect for him, and we have remained eternal friends. At different times, all these guys have helped with my development with timely advice. Once I remember being on commentary with Richie and not saying very much at all. Perhaps his mere presence had intimidated me a bit, but he turned to me and said, "If you see something you want to talk about, but it isn't on screen, don't be afraid. You can ask the director for the shot and he'll sort it." That one bit of advice from the great man made me realize that I could participate more and that he had enough faith in me to try to get more involved. It was little things like that that instilled the importance of sometimes not just concentrating solely on what was actually being broadcast, but trying to spot something different, something not quite as obvious. On another occasion, when a debatable umpiring decision had been made, I came down heavily on a particular side and said so on air. Richie was more circumspect. At the end of the session, I sought out Ian Chappell, mentioned what had taken place, and I asked Ian whether I should not be so outspoken. I wanted to know what was expected of me. After all, I was still learning. "That's Richie's style," he said. "If your style is to be forthright, neither Richie nor anyone will mind." Galliard would move on from Channel 9 to Sky Sports in the UK, and we would soon join up again, although not before the BBC made a cheeky bid to sign me to work for them for the West Indies tour to England in the summer of 1995. I was at the gas station when the phone rang. It was a gentleman from the BBC who asked if I would be available to do commentary for the summer. I won't tell you his name, because I don't want to cause any embarrassment. "We are hoping you'd be in England," he said. I was irritated. You call me at my business and ask if I'm going to be following the West Indies cricket team around the UK. I said, I don't just pack up and leave my business to follow them everywhere they go, you know. We thought you might be available for some commentary, he insisted. Are you offering me a job or not? An actual position. We'll get back to you, was his last response. A letter from the BBC arrived before Christmas in 1994. They were not offering me a job for the duration of the tour. On days when West Indies were playing, I would be paid, and they would put me up in a hotel. But when they weren't, I would have to fund myself and find my own accommodation. By this time I had formed a great relationship with John Galliard, and I called to ask for his advice on whether I should accept the offer. He was in Australia with Sky at the time covering the Ashes tour, which they beamed live back to the UK. Sky did not have rights to show live tests played in England then, just a highlight package, but showed the overseas tours. He told me not to respond and send him the contract for him to look over. Early in the new year, Galliard got back in touch. He made me an offer to work for Sky for the whole summer. They would fly me to England, pay for my board and lodging, and pay a salary for the duration of the tour. It was far superior to what the BBC was offering. 3 times more, in fact. My partnership with Sky had begun, and I went back to work for them the following summer. This time, not on a contract, but just on the days that John could fit me in. It was a much-needed boost to my finances. Melinda, my daughter, wanted to go to university in New York, and at the time, there was no way I could afford the fees. Galliard again came to the rescue with offers of work. When Melinda met Galliard a few years later, I introduced him as, "This is the man who paid for your university." They both laughed. It wasn't quite a tug-of-war for my services between the BBC and Sky. That would come later when Channel 4, Sky and TWI, who I continued to work with in the Caribbean, wanted me to join them when the principal broadcast rights for England's home tests became available in 1999. I was in Dhaka, Bangladesh, covering the ICC Championship trophy. Galliard and I were again working together, although this time it was for World Tel, a production company owned by Mark Macarenas. Channel 4 were hoping to outbid the BBC for the rights, which they eventually did with ease in a deal worth £103 million to the English Cricket Board. But they needed a production company, which is where TWI thought they could get a slice of the pie. Somehow, they managed to get in touch with me in Dhaka. The telephone lines were hugely unreliable in the city. The problem always seemed to be at its worst when I tried to call Jamaica. TWI wanted my signature because they were aware that Channel 4 were interested in me being part of their commentary team. They probably figured if they pitched to be the production company saying, "We've got Michael Holding," it would improve their bargaining position. I listened to TWI's offer, including their offer to fly me to London to meet with Channel 4 when they presented its case. But there would be no way I would sign a contract with TWI until I heard what Channel 4 had to offer. At this point, Sky wasn't involved because Galliard knew nothing of what was taking place. He only found out when I asked him if it would be possible for me to go to London on one of the off days. I had to explain everything then. It was those telephone lines that were the problem, though. I couldn't get through to Pat Russo, my friend and lawyer, to find out what Channel 4's offer was. In turn, he couldn't get hold of me. At one time, I went as far as to phone his friend in the United States and ask him to call Jamaica to see if there was a problem with the phone lines there. He called back a few minutes later to say that he had got through, no problem. The problem was obviously just getting through from Dhaka. All this back and forth was taking place over a few days, and nothing was being settled. During that tournament, the commentary team and some of the crew used to go by Mark Macarenas' suite in the evenings just to hang out and have drinks and sometimes dinner. This particular evening, I sought him out for some personal advice. I told him of the developments in England and with TWIA and Channel 4. Macarenas was not slow with counsel. He told me, if you are signing with a network like Sky or Channel 4, there's a huge difference in terms of monetary value from signing with a production company. I'll use NBC as an example. You would be labeled as an NBC person, and you get well rewarded for that. He gave me some numbers. They were big ones. So big, I had to sit down immediately. I think I may even have spilt my drink. Of course, I was being selfish. I would tell you to sign a contract with me, and then I'll sell you to Channel 4, said a laughing Macarenas. Finally, I was able to speak with Pat on the telephone. TWI had confirmed their offer. So had Channel 4. TWI's was inferior. It was less than Channel 4's offer, and it was both for the English summer and the cricket in the Caribbean. They were trying to get me as cheaply as possible, which I suppose in the business world is only natural, while Macarenas was right about the salary on offer from a network. Not for the first time I went to Gaillard, and not for the first time he told me to do nothing, and he would get back to me. Within days he offered me a 4-year contract with Sky. The terms were not as good as Channel 4, but there was never any doubt which broadcaster would get my signature. I had to show loyalty. It had to be Sky. It was an odd feeling being in demand. You have to remember that as a professional cricketer playing in the era in which I did, it was a complete novelty. Never before had organisations pursued me in this way. Okay, county teams, Sussex and Lancashire wanted me to sign to play for them at various times, but this was not the same. If it was strange to be wanted, it was wonderful to be able to finally say that broadcasting would be my career. Not to mention that I would not have to worry about finances for a few years. It was a relief, particularly after my fears over my daughter's university fees. Sadly, one of the guys responsible for securing my future is no longer with us. Mark Macarenas was killed in a car crash on his way back from church in Nagpur in early 2002. It was a sad loss as he was at a tender age and left behind a wife and children. Mark was a very good guy and great company. He really looked after the people who worked for him. He was desperate to make sure everyone was happy, and never did he just pay lip service to the idea of a contented workforce. It was one of the reasons he was such a successful businessman. His WorldTel company had pulled off a huge coup by winning the broadcast rights for the 1996 World Cup, and at the time of his death, he was the agent for Sachin Tendulkar. I will never forget the advice he gave me while fixing me a drink in Dakar, nor his spirit or friendship. As you go through life, you encounter people who have a lasting positive influence. Most are mentioned in these memoirs, and Mark was one. I raise a glass to him.
Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why, oh, why, oh, why? Hey, no holding back.
Michael Holding, No Holding Back, the autobiography. Chapter 14, From the Comms Box. Aside from the obvious importance of being able to earn a living, the greatest impact broadcasting has had on my life has been through my relationships. It has allowed me to continue some great friendships and relationships formed during my playing days. I have made many friends, but alas, I have also lost friends and supporters. It is an unfortunate trade-off that comes with the job. Some of the friends I have gained have come from an unlikely source. The players who I used to try to terrorize when I had the ball in my hand. Others are strangers whose living rooms I entered via their television sets. Many have introduced themselves to me to say how much they enjoyed my commentary. But sadly, some of those Caribbean supporters who were willing me on to terrorize those batsmen are some of those people I have lost. That is down to a perception, from a few, that I have somehow been a detractor from West Indies cricket by being honest in the commentary box. It would seem I'm only allowed to say good things about the West Indies team. It is a charge that I find ludicrous, but, I repeat, it's the view of a minority. It does not worry me though, as I am a person who prefers to concentrate on the good things in life rather than the bad. It is a source of great joy to me that commentating has allowed me to build friendships and maintain others. When working on tours in the Caribbean, I'm able to meet up with old teammates to reminisce about the good old days, reinforcing bonds that were built years before. When I go around the world and I see and work with former opponents, and this is where I've had the opportunity to start new friendships with those who were previously on the other side of the fence. Then there are those whose friendships have strengthened since playing days. David Lloyd and Ian Beefy Botham, two great characters, spring to mind. And Ian Chappell, of course. Chappell took those clashes in the spirit they were intended, others less so. They couldn't separate the battle on the field from life off it, but I wouldn't waste ink on them. Another guy who I value like Chappell is a former Indian Test batsman, Anshuman Gakwad. I wouldn't have blamed Anshuman for not wanting to have anything to do with me following the infamous Jamaica Test of 1976. This was the game when Bishan Bedi waved the white flag because he thought the West Indies bowlers were too quick on a wicket that was too inconsistent in bounce and the line of attack too dangerous to endure. I hit Anshuman, who was as gutsy a batsman as there has ever been, with a nasty blow on the ear during the game, and it turned out to be quite a serious injury. It punctured his eardrum, and he required an operation. But he never held a grudge, and we remain in contact today, sending emails and Christmas cards. Ravi Shastri is another unlikely friend. Our paths barely crossed as players, and the friendship would never have blossomed if it wasn't for commentating. We worked together a lot with Mark Macarenis' World Tel Production Company in places like India, Sharjah and Bangladesh, and we discovered we got on well, despite him being about 8 years younger. My wife has built a good friendship with his wife too, and that sort of companionship is invaluable on a tour. I often spend weeks away from home, and it is fantastic to know that if I'm working with Ravi, that Laura Ann can come out too and spend time with Ritu, Ravi's wife. In India a few years ago, Laurianne and Rita took a tour of Rajasthan together and had a great time, while the two husbands slaved away in the commentary box. Another bonus is that I'm older, wiser, and more appreciative of the different cultures of the countries I visit. As a player, you always had to stick to the arrangements made for the team, and you could not just go off and see the sights. Now I can. With no practice, training or special duties to perform in between the games, I can immerse myself in the culture of the country, something I didn't have the time or perhaps the inclination for when I was younger. It was a lot easier to explore the bright lights at night than the real country during the day. When I toured India in 1983 and Pakistan in 1980, I hated it. The major cities were fine, but away from the beaten path was torture. Going there with a negative mindset didn't help either. Now when I go back, I enjoy both countries. It has been fascinating to see Asia's transformation over the last 20-odd years. Today, I can use my mobile phone to call anyone in the world. Forgive me if that sounds a little simple, but back in the early 1980s, away from the major cities, trying to make a call was a laborious process. You would have to call the operator in the hotel, who in turn would call the operator in town. That operator would call a counterpart in Bombay or Karachi, who would then call the operator in London. That operator would then call the Caribbean island. Only then could you get connected. If any of those links were broken, you would have to start again. And it was not an instantaneous process. Usually you'd have to book a call before you left the hotel for the ground in the morning, and by the time you got back it would be connected, if you were lucky. Those days, a comforting call to family back home was a precious commodity. I first went back to Pakistan as a commentator for a series against West Indies in 1997. It was for radio, and it was the first time a fully West Indian radio commentary team had broadcast cricket back to the Caribbean. On that tour, a lot of the West Indies players were complaining about the hotels and food. They had no idea what progress had been made. I kept telling everyone that they should have been around in the 80s, although, to be fair, I spent most of my time then as a player complaining too. Wes Hall, our manager, told me, "You have no idea what progress has been made. You should have been here in the 50s. It's remarkable how perceptions change over time. If my hand was forced, I would have to say that Australia is my favourite country to tour. Even when playing there, I loved it. The weather is always good. Okay, Melbourne and Tasmania can be unpredictable, but most of the time, you know what you're getting, and the hotels are great. Ian Chappell and Richie Bennett both hail from down under, of course, and the great friendship with Ian and a good relationship with Richie are factors that help as a commentator. Nor should the giant Melbourne casino be forgotten as an attraction. England runs Australia a close second. It's the weather that lets the country down. A cliché, I know. But like most people from the Caribbean, I am always going to prefer the extreme heat to the extreme cold. So you see, all these positives of the job far outweigh the negatives of how my relationship with the fans and players has changed. I have always been very forthright in the commentary box, prepared to call a spade, and some of the West Indian fans do not like me being critical of their team. In their opinion, as a former West Indian cricketer, I should be saying only complimentary things about the West Indies team. To that, I can only say I am not a West Indian commentator. I am a commentator from the West Indies. It has often reached ridiculous proportions. I was accused of having a problem with the whole island of Antigua after doing a radio commentary on Leeward Islands versus Jamaica. Hamish Anthony took quite a few wickets in the game, but his bowling partner, Eldine Baptiste, was not as successful. I said, Anthony has not bowled as well as Baptiste. The next time I went to Antigua, I was accosted and accused of being anti-Antigua because that was where Anthony was from. The huge hole in the argument was that Baptiste was also from Antigua. Antigua is not singular in this attitude. After a few years of doing this job, I found out that as far as some are concerned, I don't seem to like any island in the Caribbean. The sad part of it all was that it did not surprise me in the least. Sure, the responses were disappointing, but that is the Caribbean for you. The insularity and island rivalry has been present since time immemorial. Some people in the West Indies only want to hear about the people from their island, and woe betide you if they hear something they don't like. Unfortunately, it has at times gone beyond childishness. I have been abused in the streets and people have shouted obscenities. Brian Lara, Carl Hooper and Shiv Chandrapal are some of the players down the years upon whom my views have sparked the most contention. An adverse reaction was guaranteed unless you said only good things about the most popular guys. I remember getting a letter from a man in New York having a pop at me for some comments about Chandrapal. He wasn't happy, but I used to get worse letters when I was bowling bouncers, so it never fazed me. Only commentators from the West Indies can really understand what it is like. Elsewhere in the world, you don't seem to get this abuse. For instance, I could be walking to the ground with Tony Greig in Australia, and someone would shout something. Greggy was always having digs at the Aussies on Channel 9. But there was always humour. It was only ever done in jest. Never did it have a nasty edge like in the Caribbean. And no one is spared. Not even the great legend of Caribbean sports writers and broadcasters, that is Tony Cozier. He cops particular vociferous stick from the Trinidadians if he writes something they don't like about one of their own. In Barbados, too, he has suffered, and he is from Barbados. He was accosted and abused when he wrote that Gordon Greenwich should start to think about retiring. Never mind, He was obviously getting close to the day. Alas, it's typical of the region. Sometimes the players can react. Since I've begun broadcasting, some have taken such offence that they have refused to speak to me. One West Indies player even brought me up in a team meeting saying, "Why is he so critical? He used to be one of us." Can you imagine that? A team meeting of all places. Once when I was on my way back to the hotel from a match in London, I offered a former player a lift, who asked if I also had room for a particular West Indies player in the taxi. Of course, I said, but when I spun round to collect him, the player refused to get in the taxi and whispered in his pal's ear. He didn't get in either. Players take offence wherever you are in the world. They can be very thin-skinned. I've said to many, it's nothing you should worry about. Concentrate on your job, don't read the papers, and know that if you're doing something wrong, your captain or teammates will tell you. That was my attitude. I never read the newspapers apart from the Sporting Life when I was a player. Again, thankfully the players who take my comments personally are in the minority, just like my playing days with the bouncers. The majority of players understand why I say what I say. I still have a lot of friends in the West Indies team because they know that no malice is intended. They know that if I make a mistake I will apologize, and they know that I will praise them when it is deserved. Some have listened to me on the radio or television and come to me for advice. Darren Powell, the West Indies fast bowler, and Phil Simmons and Ian Bishop spring to mind immediately, and there have been others. I have criticised Darren heavily on air. At Chesterley Street in 2007, the West Indies were trying to save a game with himself and Shivnarine Chanderpaul at the crease, and he got out to a ridiculous shot. West Indies lost. He shouldn't have been dropped for that shot, I said, but Darren knew he had made an error, and he didn't take it personally. I coached him when he was starting out as a fast bowler for Jamaica, and he still comes to me to talk about his game. Phil Simmons was opening for the West Indies on the 1994 one-day tour of India and had heard that I was tutting away at how he was playing across the line and as a result getting out cheaply. We were in Kotak and I was doing commentary high up in the tower that overlooked the ground when I got a message that Simmons was waiting to see me at the bottom of the steps. If that sounds threatening to you, I can assure you that I felt the same. I didn't know whether he had come along with his cricket bat and was going to hit me across the line or just wanted a chat. But I went down anyway. "What can you suggest for my batting problems?" he asked. Bishop had been having problems with his back in his later days with the West Indies team, and I didn't think he was bowling as well as he could. So I said it. In Barbados, I think my comment was something like, "He's not bowling as well as before. He's not the same Ian Bishop." He came to me for help, despite a very close family member's words ringing in his ears. "What do you want to talk to him for, when he can't say anything nice about you?" He was unfortunate. If it hadn't been for his back problems, I'm sure Bish would have turned out to be an all-time great for the West Indies. Even my own family have struggled to comprehend my desire to tell it like it is. I have been close friends with Ramnareswaran for many years, and he owns a house only 15 minutes down the road from my home in Miami. He once got out hooking in a test match in Trinidad, which contributed no end to the West Indies losing the test, and I told viewers it was a brainless shot. Well, I got it in the neck for that. Not from Ramnaresh, but Lorianne, my wife. "How can you say that?" she shouted at me. "He's been like a son. She has always looked upon him as family. I think that proves that I'm not in the business to protect friends." One man who has not been described as my friend is Brian Lara. Some will argue that I have gone out of my way to attack the man rather than defend him. It is another example of people believing that I am making personal comments instead of calling the action as I see it. People think I don't like Lara because I have often berated him for not putting the team first. It is not true that I don't like him as a person. If I didn't like Lara, I just wouldn't talk to him. I sat down with him in my hotel room for 45 minutes or more in Guyana some years ago after he approached me for a chat about what was going on in his life. If I didn't like Lara and had something personal against the man, he wouldn't have made it past the threshold. The belief that I had some sort of personal vendetta against him got so bad that I went on a radio station in Trinidad to be grilled about it. I knew what was coming, but I went anyway. Question after question was fired at me. I do not sit behind the mic purely to please people, to only tell them what they want to hear. My job is to tell them how I see it on the field and be objective. I can't color my comments depending on who is listening. It is their problem, not mine, if they can't spot the difference between someone trying to be objective and a personal attack for other reasons. Sure, commentators will have players that they like and dislike, and maybe that creeps into what they say. After all, it is hard to always keep emotions in check. I have been guilty a few times of letting my heart rule my head. I remember when I blew my top in Melbourne on the West Indies 2000 and 2001 tour. Shane Warne was bowling to a young batsman called Ricardo Powell. He was pretty new to the team. It was a one-day series after the test had been completed, and throughout the tour there had been some very poor umpiring decisions, a large number of them in favour of Australia. It was the days before we had totally independent umpires, so local umpires did all the games. Aussies could officiate an Australian game, Englishmen an England game, and so on. I had a little running battle, if you could call it that, with Bill Lowry over the umpiring decisions. I was keeping a score sheet because I was so disgusted by what I saw as a bias towards the home team. Warne managed to sneak one past Powell's bat to hit him on the pad. He must have been hit on the front foot about 9 feet down the pitch from the stumps, but Warne, as he won't, led a huge appeal and the umpire fell for it. Bill turned to me and joked, "How many times is that now, Mikey?" I was furious. "I don't care now. I've lost count," I said. "I'm wondering whether he would have been given out if he'd been wearing green and yellow." I knew that was a mistake as soon as I'd said it, not because I received lots of abuse or people thought I was being unfair, but I felt I'd let myself down by allowing my emotions to get to me. One occasion, when I was not worried about speaking my mind on the spur of the moment, was in a test match at Super Sport Park in South Africa in 2000, which will forever be tagged infamous. It was the game when Hansi Cronje declared to ensure a result against Nasser Hussein's England. Cronje, for reasons we are all now well aware of, was desperate to get Nasser to agree to a chase in the last innings. He was far too keen. He kept making proposals which were rebuffed until he went into Godfather mode and made Hussein an offer he couldn't refuse. Of course, Nasser was oblivious to Hansi's motives, and he just thought he'd been handed a great opportunity for England to win a test match. The equation involving declarations and the run chase meant that unless it rained again, there was going to be a result that would more than likely not be in England's favour. When this happened, I said, if this was in Asia, we would all be talking about bookmakers. At the time, there was talk of illegal bookies getting involved in games on the Indian subcontinent, but India was the only country mentioned. I suspect that illegal bookies were trying to influence the game as well, but of course I couldn't be sure. John Galliard, my old friend, was the producer that day, and he was straight in my ear giving me a telling off. What substance have you got to back that comment up? I took more stick off air, but would not back down. Sky TV had loads of emails flying in saying that Cronje decision was great for the game, and I was way off the mark with my comments. He had just revived a dead boring game, and it was actions like this that would help to create more interest in test matches. My fellow commentators shared such sentiments. They thought I was talking rubbish, possibly because they were naive about gambling. They were perhaps unaware of the huge sums of cash that would be put on a draw in a test match, particularly in Asia. That's why Kranya was so desperate to ensure a result. His accomplices could not stand a draw. My fellow commentators did not grasp that it wasn't about who was going to win or why Kranya was risking losing the test. It was all about the stalemate. In particular, David Gower, who is not a gambler, objected to my assertions. We had an argument about it off air, but he could not see my point. Next summer, when the you-know-what hit the fan and Kranya was exposed, I went on the lazy mic that allows you to talk to the director, who was of course John Gaillard, without it going on air, and said, "Have you anything to say?" He apologized immediately. I then tackled my fellow commentators, who were all working that day at Edgbaston. They apologized as well, and Gower was quick to leave the studio, where he was to come over, say sorry, and chat things over. He is a pretty unflappable guy, and would never shoot from the hip like I would. That is what it is like in the commentary box, much like a dressing room. You have different personalities, and what will work for one person will be alien to another. Two people I have worked with who are poles apart are Bill Lowry and Ian Botham. Bill has an eye for detail and makes sure he's 100% prepared for a day's commenting, while Beefy is, well, Beefy. At the start of the day's play, Bill is the first on the microphone for Channel 9, because he can be quite excitable, and the network thinks that he can grab the audience, pulling the viewers along with him on this roller coaster ride. He is in his seat for about 45 minutes before the first ball is bowled, checking everything is okay and ensuring he has cards with stats laid out in front of him. He is completely prepared, just as he was as a batsman. He left nothing to chance then and was meticulous in his approach. He's exactly the same as a commentator. Beefy is none of the above. He will get to the ground as late as a producer will allow him to. If he's doing his pitch report, he just walks straight out there, has a look, and is then ready to go to camera. He's not one for preparatory work, shall we say. But that does not make him any less of a commentator. The feedback from Sky viewers will attest to that. The commentator that I have to field most questions about when I'm out and about is dear old David Bumble Lloyd. Is he as bonkers as he comes across? I'm asked. Absolutely, I tell them without hesitation. Bumble can be serious when he needs to be, although most of the time he is having fun. He can get away with saying things that others can't. In Australia for the last Ashes tour, he was on particularly good form. He had an oyster fetish on that tour, and for some reason he decided to try and eat 1,000 of them over the duration of the tour. Don't ask me why. During commentary, someone asked him how his oyster opus was going. "How many are up to now?" Bumble, with a cheeky look on his face, quipped, "It puts lead in your pencil, you know." There was pandemonium in the box when he said that. His co-commentator couldn't speak for laughter. The rest of us were in a terrible state, and Barney Francis, the poor producer, could only manage a faint "Bumble, please!" but it was suppressed by his snorts. He had an unforgettable look of fear in his eyes. He knew there would be more. Bumble, knowing he had his audience and co-commentator silence, delivered the payoff. But with all that lead in your pencil, it's very important to have someone to write to.
Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why, oh, why, oh, why? Hey, no holding back.
Michael Holding, No Holding Back, the autobiography. Chapter 15. Love of the Horses. I must have been age 6 or 7 when my first love affair with horses and horse racing began. Early one morning I was raised from my slumber by my brother, Ralph, to help cut some grass from a patch of land at the back of our home on Dunrobin Avenue for his godmother and our neighbour, Nurse Skeffrey. I was always one who enjoyed my sleep, so looking back, I can't have been that happy about it, but I wanted to be with my brother when he went out on his escapades, so did what was required. Nurse Skeffrey owned a few horses, and once the grass was boxed, we got into the car for a 40-minute drive to Caymanas Park racetrack to deliver it to the beast. Not that I was awake when we got there that first morning. I had drifted back to sleep, and when I awoke, I rubbed my eyes in disbelief. The sight of these powerful, athletic animals fascinated me, and I'd caught the bug. Horse racing and cricket have always been my chief passions, and they have both enriched my life no end. Luckily, my successful cricket career has allowed me to own horses, try my hand at breeding them, and form a close friendship with the legendary trainer Sir Malcolm Stout. My brief venture into owning and breeding took place in Jamaica, where it was much easier and cheaper to get involved. I am so absorbed by the sport that when I was offered to work in the United Kingdom by Sky on the West Indies tour of 1995 and asked where I wanted to be based, without hesitation I said Newmarket. You see, on the first venture with Sky, they were paying my expenses, which included rented accommodation for the tour. Fortunately, the person asking the question was John Gaillard, the cricket producer at Sky, who knew me very well, and apart from that, accommodation in Newmarket was certainly a lot cheaper than anything in London, where the Sky offices are based. There were no objections, and with my past connections, and with the help of one particular good friend in Janet Anderson, who previously worked in Sir Michael's office, each year very comfortable abodes were always found until I bought my own house. These days, with my continued association with Sky, I spent half of my year at my home in the Cambridgeshire town of Newmarket, the epicenter of British racing. The other half is spent in Miami and Jamaica, unless I'm travelling for work in other far-flung lands. If I'm not in Newmarket, I'm always logging on to the internet to check on the form of horses and listening to the internet racing radio for the latest news. Every time I enter Sir Michael's racing stables, I still get the same buzz as I did as a youngster on the first trip to Caymanas Park. The brute force these animals have seems to contradict their manner. They have wonderful personalities, and although there are some horses who you don't want to get too close to, most you can go up to and give them a pat and a stroke. If I'm honest though, it's the speed I love most. It is very special. It is a weakness of mine, I suppose. From fast bowling to fast cars, I love it. There are few more graceful sights than a thoroughbred at full tilt, nostrils flared with muscles bulging as the body strives for the line. The horse racing and cricket communities have always mixed well too. Sir Garfield Sobers, Wes Hall, who would believe the great big fast bowler had a son who became a jockey. Richie Bernard and Mike Atherton, to name but a few, have loved their horses. Likewise, lots of horse racing people love cricket. From those early days at Caymanas Park, doing my little bit to help Nurse Skeffrey look after her horses, I progressed to being a keen student of the game, studying the form of trainers, jockeys and horses. Perhaps I should have been concentrating on my studies at Kingston College, but two friends of mine made sure my interest never wavered. They were always debating which of the two Jamaica trainers, Billy Williams and Laurie Silvera, were the best during their glory days of the 1960s and early 1970s. And of course there was much discussion about their stable jockeys, Kenneth Mattis and Winston Ellis. I didn't want to feel left out, and so I started to do my homework and added my 2 bits every now and then. Inevitably, when one takes such a deep interest in horse racing, one's eye is caught by the odds offered by the bookmakers. Now, no gambler ever admits to how much they really stake, and given I was at school at the time, I'm not about to break that rule. So let's just say I had a few pennies on each way chances. In those days, however, pennies could keep you fed for the entire day, and it wasn't uncommon for me and my clan of racing friends to not quite make it to the canteen on some school days. No cash, no lunch. I soon started taking note of what was happening in England, hearing about the great partnerships like Joe Mercier and Peter Walwyn, Jeff Lewis and Noel Merles. Later on, I went back to the country as a player. I got to appreciate such fine jockeys as Willie Carlson and Pat Edery in person. Closer associations with some of the jockeys in England came later after meeting Sir Michael. Such names as Greville Starkey and the great Lester Piggott, who we in Jamaica only read about and marvelled at their brilliance, became people I actually met. Then there was Walter Swinburne, Sir Michael's stable jockey, when I first met him. Walter was a superb rider. In a race he was always in the right position on a horse, and if he lost, it was almost never because of a mistake he had made. Rather, just a simple fact that the horse wasn't good enough on the day. I remember watching these guys in action on the track and being in awe of their talent. I was a fan in the same way that spectators would revere other sportsmen like footballers, cricketers, and golfers. And when I came to meet these people, I would be starstruck. I was like this when I first met Sir Michael. I was introduced to Stouty by Ronald Burke, a Barbados trainer. Ronald had been married to Suzanne, the daughter of Nigel Nunez, the gentleman who trained my horses in Jamaica at the time. He knew Stouty, and when he was in Newmarket in 1985, he got in touch and asked me if I wanted to come down to meet the great man. I was playing for Derbyshire at the time. He did not need to ask. All I needed was directions, and I was down there on my first day off. I've been going back ever since. When I was with Derbyshire, I had time off, or if I was just passing through the UK, I made sure the stopover was for a day or two and would go to stay with Jimmy and Shirley Scott. Jimmy was Stouty's travelling head lad, and I became good friends with them. As I have mentioned, when I signed my first long-term contract with Sky, I rented a place in Newmarket in 1999 and finally bought a house 6 years later, a modern place near the hospital. Through the association with Jimmy and Shirley, my friendship with Stouty grew. In the early days, I would just go to the yard and whenever possible watch them work on the heath. Then occasionally travel with Jimmy in the horse box to the races. Then it progressed to me being invited to the house for breakfast. Now I would go because he expects me to. What the heck? It's been more than 20 years. To this day I remain in awe of Stouty, and I am careful not to get in his way or pester him with too many questions or opinions about horses. What helps our relationship is that Stouty is a huge cricket fan. He was born in Barbados, so supports West Indies and loves to see them do well. But more important for him is seeing good cricket played. He's a purist. Of the modern era, players like Alex Stewart and Mike Atherton were his favourites because they were what he called proper batsmen, ones who knew the value of their wicket. He's not a fan of those guys who go out and play a few flashy shots and then throw it away. He loves to talk about cricket because I guess it takes his mind off the stress of training. Given the opportunity, he can talk about the game for hours, and the horses take a back seat for a while. Indeed, if I'm away on a tour, he will phone me up to talk about cricket, or a match which is ongoing. It was thanks partly to cricket that he got his knighthood, and before anyone starts wondering, it wasn't his playing. Every year he would take cricket teams made up of horse racing enthusiasts to Barbados for a tour, and because he introduced people to the island who invested in property and business, the government recommended he be knighted. He contributed a great deal to the Barbados tourist economy, and the government appreciated it. I consider it a great honor to be called a friend, and in that regard, I hope that when I'm around, I'm able to relieve some of the pressure he's under, which can be tremendous in flat racing. He's in charge of horses whose owners have paid huge sums of money for them, and much is expected, not to mention the high standards and expectancy he sets for himself. Sometimes while walking around the yard, he will have a very serious look on his face, and you know he's thinking deeply, and you don't want to disturb him. He can be very intense at times, but if you get him away from it all, he's like a kid. Over dinner, Horses will not come up in conversation at all, and he will be himself. His Caribbean edge will come out, and he will be incredibly laid back. Likewise, if you get him out on the cricket field, Stouty is an okay cricketer, and to be polite, his love of the game is greater than his skill. But of course this is true of most who don't make a living from the game and only play recreationally. He plays for the Newmarket 11 as a batsman, although his appearances are becoming fewer. He has a few good shots, and I'll admit that his cover drive is not too shabby. I used to join him and other famous horse racing names like Julian Wilson, William Haggas and Ed Dunlop in the Newmarket 11 in the early days when I still found it fun to get involved. My last game was against the Royal Household at Frogmore on the grounds of Windsor Castle in 2003 after being dragged out of retirement. Thankfully, Stouty has never asked me for tips on how to improve his run-making ability because I have never been known to beat around the bush, but I am quite happy to discuss the game with him. I must admit that I got a huge buzz in the summer of 2008 when Stouty said something very special about me during an interview with the BBC's Rishi Persad. Rishi had come up to the yard to do a piece about Stouty and his Derby entrance, and he interviewed me for a bit, because I was always around, and then he spoke with Stouty. When I saw it on television a few days later, I was stunned. "Mikey is part of the team," said Stouty. Well, when I heard that, I felt terrific. It lifted me no end. Here was one of the greatest trainers ever saying I was helping out as part of the team. Now, I might help to move a horse pen every now and again, carry a bucket of food to the stable door once in 24 years, or give the lads and lasses a leg up, but that's about it. Most of the time, I'm just observing, on the heath, from 6 in the morning, or listening to the chatter over breakfast, or just mixing with the lads and lasses in the yard. People have asked me what I think about Stouty as a trainer. I tell them that the figures are there for all to see. He has been training winners of the biggest races since 1978 and was the only 20th century trainer to win a classic in 5 successive seasons. What people don't see, however, is how Stouty is around the yard or on the gallops. It is a privilege to see, and having enjoyed watching him at work for many years, I have come to the conclusion that he is a genius. The guy must have an incredible memory. I have come to believe that it must be photographic, and this opinion is reinforced when I watch him writing imaginary notes in the middle of his palm with his imaginary pen. I think that's how he imprints things on his brain. And believe it or not, sometimes he writes imaginary notes and then rubs them out, as if he doesn't want anyone to see them. Only very rarely will you see him studying the real notes about a horse. As they walk past him in the morning, he will know exactly what each of them has done. He won't have a piece of paper to tell him, and he'll just shout out the instructions to the jockey as they pass. Sometimes he will stop one of them, have a think, and then it will come to him what this particular horse needs to be doing. Then the instructions will be issued again. I look on in wonder at how he can remember it all. It would have been hard enough for a trainer who has 20 horses, but Stouty has up to 200. Only on what are called work mornings, when most of the horses do serious fast work, will he always have his worksheet. When watching him work with the horses, it can pay to stay quiet, because he will make certain comments that make your ears prick. Nothing like, "Hey, have a bet on this one," but maybe, "That horse has improved for the run." When he utters these words, you know that this is a horse to watch. One year, he had 5 fillies out that were all being prepared for classic races. We had just had a particular bad spring and the ground was very soft. One of these horses had not yet enjoyed the ground at all and had really backed off its work. On a late morning in June, this filly was out again to do fast work, and Stouty narrowed his gaze as he studied it, working past him. He smiled and rubbed his hands together as an unrecognizable sound came from his lips. It was almost like someone blowing into a musical instrument, only not so musical. It is a famous thing that he does when he sees something he likes. She's only rated 82, you know, Mikey, was the comment, as he rode off on his hack to meet the horse at the top of the gallop. Next time that horse ran, it was a handicap at Haydock Park, and I had my biggest ever bet. No need to say what happened. Gamblers don't talk too much about losing bets. Prior to this, I had backed his horses religiously because I was unable to separate my emotions from facts and figures. I wanted them to win, so I would bet on them. As a punter, this was a recipe for disaster. But as time has gone on, I have been able to put my feelings to one side. I still want them to win, but when all good sense says they won't, I keep my money in my pocket. And as I've been able to spend more and more time with the horses and watching them at work, I have formed my own opinions, and I might mutter to myself such things as, "That ain't so good," or "mediocre. Ain't never going to back that," or more times than not, want to keep tabs on. Backing winners always gives you a great feeling, but backing one of Stout's winners is even more pleasurable, especially if it's a meaningful race. One of Stout's horses that I backed recently was Conduit, and its Breeders' Cup Turf Triumph at Santa Anita in 2008. Laurie and I had made the trip over to California. Laurie-Ann had a marathon to run in San Diego on the Sunday, and I thought it was an ideal opportunity to fit the Breeders' Cup meeting in on the Friday and Saturday. Before the race, my palms were sweating and my heart was thumping in my chest. I was oblivious to the people around me. During the race, I was shouting and screaming, and the Americans, who were all cheering on their own hotly fancied horses, soon became quiet as Conduit stormed to victory. With all the noise I was making, they must have thought, "Who is this guy?" It's a great feeling to see a horse win a big race like that when you have followed its progress in the yard, much like the lift you get when a horse you own wins a race. I have owned a few in my time, although to put the record straight, not the one named Whispering Death. It was pure coincidence that it was named after me. I just happened to phone the trainer, William Haggis, when he was with the owners when they were discussing what they should call it. "It's Mikey, I've got to take the call," he said. After he hung up, they asked him which Mikey was that, so Whispering Death it was. My horse racing owning days were in Jamaica, but I got out of the game in 1998 because I was spending too much time away from home, and there was no point in owning horses and not being around to see them run. However, I got great pleasure from it, memorably from my first horse called Undercover. Trainer Nigel Nunes had Undercover, which had not been picked up from a stud farm sale, and it was available to buy. I never had the sort of money being asked for, so he asked if I wanted to lease it. I went to Howard Hamilton, the friend I had met years before when he was working with Shell, when they sponsored the domestic competition in West Indies, and suggested sharing the training fees with him. These were the only expenses that we incurred under the deal, and we got to pocket any prize money won. At the end of Undercover's racing days, it went back to the original owners for breeding purposes. Undercover was far from top class, but still managed to win quite a few races. We had a system in Jamaica where the best horses were ranked A1, and then the rest would follow A2, B1, B2, and so on. Undercover made it to A2, but didn't win any races in that section. Early in her racing career, in a prep for a race classic, she went off at 99-1, so it'd be fair to say that Howard and I did not have high hopes that afternoon. Surprisingly, she led the field for the whole race until the last furlong and finished fourth. After the race, Howard, in an excitable state, went out onto the track to lead Undercover in because he was so proud. Howard has owned and continues to own many outstanding horses in Jamaica, but he couldn't believe the race Undercover had run. When he was leading our steed back in, he was looking at her as if to say, "How have you done that? You don't have that ability." Undercover spoilt me because when your first horse does so well, you think the racing game is easy. It's not. It is a tough business. One of my horses fractured a knee in its first ever race and never raced again. That can be heartbreaking. But others like Precocious and Bunny's Hallow won one race and had a handful respectively. Overall, I have to say I've been very lucky with my horse ownership exploits in Jamaica. Not so much in the UK, however. Walter Swinburne and I formed a great friendship, and when he took over from his father-in-law Peter Harris and started training, I got involved in 2 syndicates at his stables. Neither ventures proved fruitful, but there is still time, and it's a lot less expensive than actually purchasing a horse. Who knows what might come of it? It's difficult to explain the buzz you get from watching a horse you own race. You just feel on top of the world when your horse wins. It's an adrenaline rush that I never experienced in cricket. It's probably superior to taking a wicket in a test match because the feeling lasts so much longer. If I worked out a plan for a batsman and it came off, or if I dismissed a particularly dangerous batsman, I would be elated, but would have to come down again from that high to an even keel to concentrate on the next ball. After your horse has won, the feeling doesn't leave you. It will be with you when you leave the course and when you're having supper that evening. It will still be there when you wake up in the morning. Fast bowling didn't do that. A recent highlight arising from my horse passion was when I was invited to take part in the royal procession at Royal Ascot in 2009. I was forewarned that someone who worked for the Queen would be calling me to ask if I would like to attend, which was just as well, as I would have reckoned it was a wind-up. Anyway, Lorian and I went. With me in a hired top hat and tails, I'd never had a call for such attire before. To have lunch with Her Majesty at Windsor Castle before joining the procession in the carriages for that famous ride down the Ascot Strait, then spent the day in the royal box. It was a real honour and something I'm unlikely to experience again. I was, of course, on my best behaviour, even if the Queen and I did have a chat about cricket. I think it would be right if I kept to myself what she said.
Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why, oh, why, oh, why? Why, oh, why, oh, why? Hey, no holding back.
Michael Holding, No Holding Back, the autobiography.